Okay, so welcome back everyone to CPG's Supply Chain of Thought podcast. In our first episode a few weeks back, we explored the potential impact of Trump tariffs on goods imported from China, which is what CPG tends to focus on. Today, we're doing a deeper dive into how tariffs impact specific industries. And today, we're going to focus on the US transportation industry. I am here with our CEO and founder of CPG, Michael De Clercq, again. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you, Laura. Good to see you again on this platform. I was looking forward to discussion. These tariffs are certainly keeping all of us active and busy.
On our toes, that's for sure.
Yeah, and transportation, of course, is the backbone of the supply chain. And it's an interesting topic because when you mention tariffs, people think about the actual products that are being sourced, but the transportation industry has also been affected.
Absolutely. Tariffs are affecting trade, and so they will no doubt affect the transportation industry. And you've been in sourcing for decades, and that is related to obviously the transportation industry for freight and shipping. But today we are focusing more on the U.S. impact to transportation in the U.S. However, we will touch on those other topics as well. So I'm really interested in getting your take on this whole situation after so many years of being in this industry or in this field. So, just a note for our listeners today, we are using the IDS format again. It's identify, discuss, and solve format. So, the issue we've already identified is the impact of these tariffs on the US transportation industry. And then we're going to discuss some questions we've been getting a lot recently. And then the last section is the solve or the solution section, where we talk about some, practical and actionable things that people can do to mitigate the impact of these tariffs. I think another point to note is that this situation is really dynamic, changing all the time, even by the hour. And so today we will be speaking high level in general about the impact of these recent tariffs on this industry.
Makes sense.
All right. So, first question is really very general, big picture question, Michael. What do you see will happen to the US transportation industry? What do you think the impacts will be?
Okay, so let's think about this clearly. The transportation industry is, again, the backbone of the supply chain. It's what gets the goods from manufacturer to end user. And in many different ways, tariffs present both challenges and opportunities to that segment. If we reflect on both of these aspects, we can address first the negatives, right? And I think what we're looking at quite clearly is that there's a higher cost for vehicles and equipment. And that's directly linked to the product itself, which is being sourced outside of US borders and subject to tariffs, whether that product is a manufactured product or even, as we know now, the raw material itself, aluminum or steel, that will affect the cost of what the transportation industry is using in terms of equipment.
So, what you're saying basically is that tariffs levied against fully assembled trucks, that are coming into the United States, Volvo, Daimler, the prices will go up for those, but you're saying that the prices will also go up for trucks built in the United States because of the reliance on imported parts. Is that correct?
That's correct. So, and again, if it's a big subject, and we're going to address general concepts. And in this case, we're talking about the trucking industry, the trucking segment, if you want, of the transportation industry. But you could argue that the same concept applies to shipping as well as airplanes and things like that. So, but you're correct. The U.S. transportation industry uses imported trucks, but also uses a lot of domestic trucks, and the tariffs will affect both. So you have U.S. brands like Peterbilt. They use some important parts, and they're going to be faced with higher production costs because of that. And so, made in the USA trucks will cost more to the end users, to basically the transportation companies. There's no way around that as far as we can see. It's a simple law of supply and demand.
Yeah, and on that note, I think there will be a ripple effect because, fully assembled trucks are more expensive. Those made in the US are more expensive. Companies will be seeking to purchase used vehicles potentially, but more people will be doing that. So, supply and demand, the prices of used trucks and vehicles will probably be increasing also.
Yeah, so used trucks, that's a very good point, Laura. So you would think that, I mean, the short term reaction is okay, so if all these imported new things are US made trucks and imported trucks are going to be expensive, I'll just turn around and buy used trucks. But that doesn't work either for the very reason that you mentioned, because the price of used trucks are going to go up because of this supply and demand rule.
Okay, so we've talked about the increase in pricing for these essentially three different types of trucks and vehicles, those imported fully manufactured here and used. We're talking about the negative impacts right now. Other things that you can think of in addition to price hikes.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like we're going to have increasing fuel and operating costs, and that's going to be because of another aspects of traffic. You're going to have retaliatory tariffs from other countries. It's We can see that coming. We've already seen it, and it's another very specific impact on the transportation industry. And finally, the other element is the disruption of the supply chain, which now affects the products that are being bought. And once you disrupt that, then you're going to have issues related to freight costs, and you're dealing with a finely tuned transportation industry machinery, which is very efficient and therefore very cost effective. Once you start changing those dynamics, you end up with a higher cost, especially in the short term. If things stabilize over time, then the efficiencies come back in.
Makes sense. Now, how about some positives? We're talking about negatives right now. There has been some discussion about the fact that these tariffs have short term positives, such as increased use of freight and domestic trucking and rail services, because people are trying to stockpile goods in the US. Do you see those as positives?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I appreciate your thorough approach of, looking at both the positives and the negatives. And from where I'm sitting, there don't seem to be a lot of positives, but it's a good exercise to explore. There's always two sides, right, to every coin. So what you brought up as a potential upside for the transportation industry is, I think, correct. There's going to be a stockpiling of goods, which is going to be beneficial in the short term to the transportation industry. And then the other element that deserves mentioning, at least, is that it will encourage domestic production, and you could make the case that this would be beneficial to the transportation industry because it increases trucking and rail demand within the United States.
Right. Yeah. I think that that was the next point I was going to mention because you did say there were challenges and opportunities. And so you're basically saying that some of the opportunities are that domestic in production in the United States could increase, and then domestic demand for the transportation industry will increase. Is that what you're referring to in terms of opportunities amidst these challenges?
Well, I it's partially that. I think so. My attitude is, as you know, Laura, in life there are no problems, there's only opportunities. So when we look at tariffs and we say these are problems, we must also respond to the notion that there may be opportunities. In my view, these opportunities are best translated from a operational point of view from each company. In other words, companies are faced with a set of circumstances. How they react to those circumstances is where the opportunities arise for them. But if you look at tariffs per se, and you say, what are tariffs impacts on the transportation industries? Are there opportunities for that whole industry in the as a result of tariffs? I think those opportunities are very limited. And if you scratch yourself and you go deeper into that problem, the only opportunities, in my view, that you can point to are potentially, again, this whole concept of dealing with an increased traffic because people are trying to stockpile. That's a very short-term kind of blip. And in the longer term, assuming that it creates more domestic manufacturing, you could make the case. I don't think it's a strong case, but you could make the case that it would help grow the domestic trucking and rail demand. It won't do any good for the shipping or the air freight, but potentially rail and trucking might increase. And that is something that deserves analysis, but I'm not even convinced that it's a strong case.
So, what about manufacturing of domestic vehicles to support the industry? That could also see an increase, but I imagine not the same type of increase in, manufacturing jobs that we saw, decades ago.
So you're saying manufacturing of trucks in the United States might benefit from.
Yeah, I mean that is what is being said. I feel like, because I think a lot of the tariffs in many industries are aimed. One of the aims, in addition to negotiating chip, is to increase domestic production. So specifically in the transportation industry, potentially it could increase domestic production of trucks. But then again, you have that caveat where a lot of the parts are coming from overseas. So it's not as simple as what it
Well,
sounds.
so two points. First, domestic production of trucks is, as you said, linked to imported parts, and you have uh, a very sophisticated supply chain in the automotive industry, which primarily relies on Canada and Mexico, Mexico being the bigger partner, if you want, in that supply chain. And you'll have like truck parts going in and out of those two countries more than once, and if you're going to have tariffs, that's going to totally disrupt that supply chain. That's one issue that causes, as I said earlier, the production of domestic trucks. Companies like Peterbilt, brands like Peterbilt will end up having higher costs, and they will pass those on, and therefore you could argue that from a that may make the domestic truck industry better or more profitable. But don't forget that the transportation industry is an end user of these trucks. So they're going to suffer. Doesn't matter if the trucking industry does well, the transportation industry is going to suffer because their costs are going to be higher.
All right. Speaking of suffering, I think another question and that I'm hearing a lot lately is that basically the uncertainty surrounding the tariffs and what might happen is actually worse than the tariffs themselves. Because you've mentioned, with every challenge there is an opportunity, and I think at CPG we always take that approach. However, if you don't know what the reality will be, it's all uncertain, it's hard to know what strategy to take. So, do you think it's true that the uncertainty is worse than the tariffs themselves?
Yeah, in general, I think that the biggest problem about tariffs is the uncertainty. That's just my view about tariffs in general. So, what do I mean by that? I mean that if you say, tell you what we're going to do, we're going to increase tariffs on this product by 10%, and the whole world knows that this is going to be the new rule for the next 10 years. Okay, that has little uncertainty. I mean, it creates this blip, but then after that, everybody settles down, and you can plan accordingly. What we're seeing here is a very high level of volatility in terms of making decisions, and that high level of volatility has to do with what I call transactional negotiation postures. So we understand why, at least we can surmise why these things are happening, why tariffs are being threatened, then implemented, then cut back, then there's a change of mind, and all of this creates chaos. Another word for the anxiety caused by uncertainty, right? So we may understand why it happens, and that element of uncertainty is being addressed, but we don't understand how it's going to affect the future. We don't understand if there will be more tariffs or less tariffs. We cannot predict if certain countries like Canada will be subject to tariffs on certain products or not. We cannot predict whether Mexico is going to react positively to this transactional negotiation posture, or if they're going to react negatively. The same applies to Europe, the same applies to Asia, and therefore you have great uncertainty. And what happens when you have great uncertainty? Why do I keep saying that this is probably the biggest factor? Is that people freeze, business leaders freeze. If they don't know what the future holds, they cannot make decisions, which means they cannot invest, they cannot hire, and they basically sit in a status quo type frozen attitude. And that is especially bad for the transportation industry, which is an industry that relies on long-term planning.
Right.
So suddenly you can't do that anymore. And that, in my view, is a very big problem.
Yeah, agree. Absolutely agree. And that's what I've been hearing, and that's what we've been seeing, I think, in our business as well. A lot of hesitation and just delaying of making big strategic decisions. So, how about let's just pretend, let's remove the uncertainty and assume, I guess is the word, worst case scenario. So, tariffs applied across the board. This has already happened. 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum from every country, for example. So, just assume that they're going to happen. It's going to be the worst case scenario. Who absorbs the costs in the transportation industry in the United States? Who do you think will be the primary sort of stakeholder that absorbs the costs?
Well, I mean, again, when you have, you just mentioned, 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum from everybody, and we are told that it's going to make things cheaper, and but that to me is patently absurd, right? Obviously, let's be clear. You increase tariffs on steel and aluminum, all products that require and use those materials will go up in prices. Domestic US industries that will thus be protected from competition will raise their prices. Of course, why not? we're all capitalists and we want to make money. If we don't have to fear the competition, our prices are going to go up in our system. We don't have an authoritarian regime that dictates what our pricing is allowed to be. Therefore, prices will go up. But that's just a comment on those commodity tariffs on commodities such as steel and aluminum.
Mhm.
Specifically, if we're going to, if you talk about, how do tariffs impact in general.
And who absorbs the costs?
Well, again, if demand is inelastic, if you don't have alternatives to your current product or services, then costs will inevitably get passed on to the consumers, right?
Can you give me some examples of those inelastic demand in this industry, just to make it crystal clear for everyone?
Yeah. So as we spoke about earlier, if you have higher prices for, say, imported parts, and you don't have a choice, you have to import them. That's inelastic, and that's going to create higher trucking, rail, and shipping costs because these are the industries that are consuming these products. Now, alternatively, you have the possibility that the demand is elastic, which means there are alternatives. It's a bit like if you say, okay, well, if trucking prices go up, I've got rail. So that you have a more elastic situation. And in that case, companies may be willing to absorb costs. In other words, the trucking company is going to say, well, I'm not going to pass on all of my costs because I'm going to lose business to the rail industry. And therefore, in that case, companies are going to be willing to absorb some of these tariff costs.
Okay, so demand is essentially elastic when there are other options, so people can go elsewhere,
Correct.
and inelastic when there's few choices, few alternatives. That means increase in costs will increase prices for the end user.
Yeah. And one way to reflect on this is when I say demand is inelastic, it also means that all players are confronted by the same problem. And again, when you talk about passing on costs, a big factor is this going to impact my market? Am I going to lose business if I increase costs?
Right.
If all my competitors also are faced with the same issue, then I'll pass on the cost, and they will too, because there's that inelasticity. We don't have a choice, in other words.
So, looking on an international level, because we are focused on the US transportation industry, but this is related to transportation partners, companies carrying goods, freight companies. And I assume they're going to be in the same boat as well. They're going to be feeling this impact of these higher prices and costs as well, even though they might get a temporary boost in demand.
Yeah, I mean, look, all transportation carriers are going to be affected by tariffs. They are already affected by tariffs. And it doesn't matter, there could be companies like JB Hunt in trucking, Union Pacific in rail, Maersk, Danish firm in sea freight, and even FedEx, which is a big player in a segment of the transportation business, will have to deal with increased costs. And they do have to deal with them in several different ways. The costs from tariffs hit them in different ways. And those ways are, you can pretty much think of them in terms of higher equipment costs,
Yep.
rising fuel prices, and shifting supply chains. And that'll apply to the whole transportation industry, as we mentioned earlier.
Yep, absolutely. So another hot topic right now is really the tariffs on our neighbors, Mexico and Canada, and the impact of those tariffs on our neighbors, and the comparison of the impact. to China. So, how will Mexico and Canada be impacted differently than China, for example, that has also been hit with new tariffs? They're for many goods at 50% now, other goods 100%.
Well, it's a very good question, Laura. I mean, people who simplify kind of think, tariffs are tariffs. It makes no difference if it's Canada or China, but in reality, it makes a very big difference. And the very big difference has to do with the reason for tariffs and the geopolitical factors that control those reasons. So the administration has to consider who they're applying tariffs to. And obviously, Canada and Mexico, who are US allies and neighbors, benefit from strong geopolitical connections. They're allies, they're neighbors, and that translates over decades into an intricate um, supply chain connectivity, if you want, that has been well established over a very long time. China doesn't have that ally and neighbor benefit. China is far away. And the potential reluctance, if you want, that the administration may have in regard to Mexico and Canada is not going to be manifest in the same way in China. It'll still be there, uh, but for a different reason. So I think it's clear how Canada and Mexico are intricately linked to the US economy and to the US supply chain. And I think it's very clear how that affects the transportation industry in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one element that is obviously different is that the trucking industry benefits from Canada and Mexico. Trucking industry doesn't really benefit as much from China. It only benefits in the sense that it picks up merchandise at the port and sends it to inland destinations. But again, the geopolitical factor is the big differential here.
Right.
And just to be clear, on the China side, there is one element of geopolitical um, import, and that is the China market that appeals to US industries. So there is a very large amount, if you were to tabulate, there's a very large amount of business done by US industries like Walmart, Tesla, Pfizer um, in China. And when I say a very large amount, you're looking at $600 billion of business done by US companies in China. So that creates that kind of link. The other link that you have is trade, a trade link. In other words, China buys stuff from America, for example, from the agricultural sector. And so when you're confronted by a tariff regimen of the administration and you're trying to again figure out the impact of that tariff, there's going to be a very different behavior in respect to Canada and Mexico than there will be with China. But it also doesn't mean that the administration will totally cancel out China and say it doesn't matter, because there are other different kinds of geopolitical links and trade links that the administration must be mindful of.
You know, it's an interesting point because even if they wanted to eliminate China, let's think of the transportation industry and manufacturing vehicles and trucks. There's been a push to manufacture in Mexico to reduce reliance on China. However, what I think many people fail to understand is that a large percentage of those components and raw materials still come from China. So there still is that reliance on China. 70 to 80% are the numbers I'm seeing. So this whole manufacturing in Mexico, it's not a panacea. It's one avenue, but it's quite complex.
Yeah, it is complex. And again, you're disrupting a well-established supply chain structure. with those tariffs. And it took decades to build these structures.
Right.
And these structures were built and over time by people who invested, and they invested, as we spoke earlier, because they had vision as to what the future held. And in other words, there was predictability. And as a result, that supply chain became very efficient. And by efficient, I mean very cost efficient. In other words, people would buy, they would need a specific part, they would buy it from the lowest cost supplier, equivalent quality, but lower price. And as a result of that, you get this trade. And it, Laura, it's tariffs are directly linked to global trade, right? And the global trade system was not established overnight. It took a long time, and we don't want to spend time today on the history of global trade, but let's agree that it took a long time and that it has become pretty efficient. And at the same time, it is intricately connected. And if you start pulling pieces out of that structure, you create inefficiencies, immediate inefficiencies. Things start to collapse and people have to repair. And inevitably, what comes out of that is higher costs. And those higher costs, then the question becomes, well, for how long? You know, is it a short-term thing or is it a long-term thing? And once you address that question, you're back to uncertainty. We don't know for how long, because we don't know how long these disruptions will occur. So, yeah, again, excellent question on comparing North America trading partners with China. They each have their idiosyncrasies, but they're very different.
Yeah, I would even go as far to say that you talk about this linkage, this global linkage between trade. And I think in many ways right now, we're inextricably linked with China and Mexico. We'd have to take drastic measures to remove one piece of this equation. And to a large extent, I think we've taken those measures and they haven't really worked. So, for example, I'm thinking of the 100% tariff on electric vehicles that are imported from China that was levied, I think it was almost a year, last May. And that was aimed at sort of keeping these electric vehicles out of the US economy. However, I think that meanwhile, China has been becoming more innovative and they've been using more technology. So their electric vehicle capability to produce these vehicles has improved, become more efficient. And even with 100% tariff on these vehicles, they're still cheaper than Teslas and European electric vehicles. So,
Yeah.
this attempt to sort of remove this one big piece, this link to China and goods sourced from China and parts, it sort of backfired in my mind because as a result, their manufacturing has just continued to become increasingly efficient.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're bringing up, Laura, which is interesting, is intent, right? And the intent of the administration has been expressed quite clearly. And on the one hand, there is this whole concept of, reshoring. We want to make everything in America. On the other hand, there is a punishment element. We want to punish we don't want the Chinese automotive industry to be better than ours. And so the way that we're going to do this is we're going to shut our markets from them. We're going to punish them this way. Our automotive markets are going to become stronger. Our automotive manufacturing is going to become stronger. But in my view, that philosophy is incorrect. In other words, the more you nurture and protect your own industries and protect them from competition, the less efficient they become, the less innovative they become. And to the contrary, when you try and punish these Chinese industries, they are constrained by circumstances to become a heck of a lot more productive, a heck of a lot more innovative. They have to be better and different. And this is very obvious in the automotive industry, as the president of Ford, who visited China a few months ago, noted. But we also see it in another factor, which kind of exploded in our face in the AI element of competitivity. Here the US constrained the uses of chips, and Chinese companies were forced to innovate. Next
Mhm.
thing you know, they come up with a product that we don't have in the US, much cheaper and everything else. And so to me, all of this confirms the notion that human ingenuity is fostered by competition. And it confirms what we frankly have known for a long time, that world trade, which has been in place for many decades, even though it creates challenges, but it also has created very significant economic opportunities for the United States. And the attempt at tariffs is to unseat this global trade structure. And in my view, that is going to not just create disruption, but will increase cost and will reduce efficiency across the spectrum.
Unfortunately, I agree with you, and I say unfortunately because these are impacts that I don't want to see, but I also think that people are innovative, so perhaps with these challenges and all the uncertainty, we will still see some positive outcomes from this in the near future. I'm hopeful.
Right. Well, we got to stay positive.
All right, so let's talk about a last segment before we move on because we are running out of time here. Really long term consequences, both positive and negative. What do you see for the logistics industry, specifically to the United States? What are the long term impacts of these? I would even call trade wars happening right now.
Well, again, I mean, I appreciate your asking that question, but you're going to inevitably, you know what I'm going to say about long-term impacts. If we don't know what the rules are, it's very difficult to predict long-term impact. We can speak in general terms of, companies shifting productions to avoid tariffs, changing trade routes. We can touch upon increased costs and ways to deal with that. But at the end of the day, uncertainty is what stymies the effort to predict, long-term consequences for the transportation industry. So we have to be honest and say, we don't know. We
Right.
don't know what the long-term consequences are because we don't know what the traffic regimen will be. We don't know what will come out, what will stay on the table once the dust settles. And until we
Will the
know,
dust settle? When will it settle? Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. We don't know any of that. Right now, it doesn't look. It's certainly we have very little clarity based on current events.
Agree. Okay, so last section, the solutions or the solve section, we should, because we've talked about a lot of sort of negative things today, but I think it would be helpful to discuss, what transportation businesses can do to manage these challenges. What are the practical, actionable strategies that companies can take to offset these tariff-related costs, impacts?
Yeah. So it's important to address solutions, Laura. I agree with you, and I appreciate your pushing for that kind of approach. But we're dealing with the transportation industry. Transportation industry is very large and it's complex. And if you're going to offer specific solutions, you're going to have to do it uh, for specific segments of the transportation industry. You're going to have different solutions, for example, for FedEx, which address less than full truckload of products, than you're going to have for large, trucking firms. You're going to
Mhm.
have a different solution for the rail companies than you will have for airlines, for example.
Makes sense.
And if you were to think of for each of these industries, within these industries, you would do a pretty in-depth analysis of the dynamics of that industry in order to come up with a sensible solution package, if you want. And that by far exceeds the scope of this podcast. But if we're going to stick to, if you want, procedural solutions, then we can examine the elements that we spoke about, and we said, okay, well, one of the problems of tariffs is going to be higher equipment costs. So what are the general solutions there? Where you have one solution is negotiate better pricing with your suppliers. Everybody's in that boat together, and the suppliers have a vested interest in doing that. So that's one potential solution. The other one is to diversify your suppliers without abandoning your core suppliers, because you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? So you need to be, again, you don't know for sure what's going to happen. So you keep what's working and you explore alternatives. And that in general has to do with building resilient supply chain. But keep in mind, building resilient supply chains, a supply chain can be extremely resilient, but then also extremely costly. So you have that paradox. You need to build something that is both resilient and low cost. And so you need to evaluate and study that challenge. Another solution in terms of equipment cost is you may want to lobby the administration to get a waiver. And that seems to be one of the things that the administration likes to do. They like to have people coming to them and asking for a favor. And so there may be solutions there for certain companies, certain product lines.
Can you explain that a bit further? So you're basically requesting to be, what's the word, waived from the impact, or?
Yeah. You're saying, look, you're going to put tariffs, you're going to put 25% tariffs on Chinese electronics. Can you count me out? Can you, for me, can I not pay those tariffs? And you might scoff at that and say, well, that's unlikely. But it's not unlikely. It's quite common. One notable example is that in the first Trump administration, when tariffs were imposed on China, Apple got a waiver. Apple used to bring all their, as you remember, all of their iPhones from China, and they could not have taken a hit, as 25% hit, and they secured a waiver with the U.S. administration, but with the Trump administration at the time. But again, that means, you have to be in the good books of the administration. You have to convince them that this is a good idea. And generally speaking, that means lobbying. And lobbying, as you know, Laura, costs money. So all these increase the costs for U.S. companies, but in many cases, it may be worth it. And I'm offering this as a solution because it is there. It's not really applicable, you might argue, for smaller companies, because, again, you don't have the muscle to necessarily make your case. But it is within the realm of solutions.
Okay, so again, negotiating better costs, diversification, building a resilient supply chain, which will come with increased costs, but will probably be worth it. Lobbying the administration for a waiver. Anything else that you'd like to suggest?
No, generally speaking, again, you have the traditional solutions in terms of equipment cost. You can find ways to perhaps make them in other countries, in lower tariff countries. But again, we don't know what those countries are today.
So you mean assemble them in other countries?
Yeah. And the whole concept of assembly is complex also because you have country of origin percentages. Like you said earlier, Laura, if you assemble things in Mexico and benefit from lower tariffs there, hypothetically, how many Chinese components are allowed in that? That's a factor that applies. If Peterbilt trucks are made in the USA, can they put the made in USA label only if 100% of the parts come from the USA? The answer is no, they don't. It doesn't have to be 100%. Well, what is that percentage?
Right.
Is it 70%? Is it 50%? So again, all this falls under the header of uncertainty. We don't know, or perhaps we should say we don't know yet. Now, there's two other categories. One is for the transportation industry. One is fuel and commodity prices. How do you deal with that? And frankly, I think it's not very helpful to say this in a solution segment, but I don't think there's much you can do to fight fuel and raw material increases, and except to look for alternatives, including alternative fuel. Maybe you want to
Electric.
you want to switch your trucks to electric trucks. I know that some manufacturers like Tesla would probably love that. And then eventually the other thing, that the last element, is dealing with shifting supply chains. What are the solutions with that? And in other words, the transportation industry, their customers are the companies that move products through the supply chain, right? If those movements are changed because of tariffs, what's the solution to that? And the solution, I think, is to remain agile. So in my view, a lot of this has to do with knowledge, what's going on, to be able to anticipate where changes will occur and how they will occur, require, I think, an investment in knowledge acquisition.
Right.
So that's what I would say in terms of solutions.
Those are really good solutions. I've been thinking of one in particular quite a bit lately. I see it more of a short-term solution because this is something we have explored for our existing clients, and that is, shipping goods to a country that is not so heavily impacted by tariffs, or lower tariff countries such as Vietnam and India. And I was thinking of this because, I think it is a good solution. It's something to explore. However, it's also a loophole. And I was sort of comparing it to this de minimis loophole that was put in place almost 100 years ago, which allows goods, parcels of $800 or less, to enter the United States duty free. And this loophole has been under attack recently. And so it was eliminated for a short time last month, and now it's been reinstated. And so I think other loopholes, such as assembly in a third country, will also become, not a viable option in the near future. Will probably be.
Well, Laura, I think you make very good points. In other words, if a country, and you mentioned India, you mentioned Vietnam, but even Mexico, in theory, right? You could, in other words, if an assembled product from China is subject to very heavy tariffs, but not the components of that, then you can take the components, ship them to one of these countries, and say, that country benefits from lower tariffs, therefore I'll still be able to bring my assembled product into the United States. So that works well in theory, as long as these other countries are not subject to sudden tariffs. And so then you have to sort of factor in the political concern, and the political concern is where your examples come in. For example, India, does America as a country have a vested interest in making friends with India? If you anticipate that the answer is yes to that question, then you may want to, and this is back what I said about agility and knowledge seeking. This is where you might say, I tell you what, I'm going to take a punt and try and assemble these products. You're also correct that it's a loophole of in a way, because suddenly the US could say, well, wait a second, assemble products with the Chinese components, we will also, but again, the rapport between the countries is a big factor in the tariff game. And it's all transactional at this point. Is you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And it seems to be logical. It seems to be, for example, you mentioned the de minimis traffic, which directly affects, of course, the transportation industry, because de minimis affects trucking, affects air freight, affects small parcel delivery like FedEx. All of these companies are affected. And then you say, well, $800, how come we don't levy tariffs against that? It seems logical to say we should. But here again, there's a practicality element in implementing such a policy. In other words, who's going to inspect those millions of packages and determine whether the correct tariffs are allocated? The
Right.
cost of implementation is much higher than if you want filling that loophole, which is the reason for the de minimis argument, which was set in place such a long time ago in the first place. And you will find, Laura, that this whole tariff disruption is also subject to this cost discipline. In other words, if you change all the tariffs, who's in charge? How many
Right.
thousands of people will you need to hire in order to make sure that it's properly implemented? And
Absolutely.
these are all open questions.
Absolutely. And they're open questions, and they're, as you've sort of outlined this whole hour, almost hour, it's not easy to answer.
Yeah,
Um, Things are dynamic and changing all the time.
yeah,
So yeah, I think we're on the same page regarding that, staying agile, and one way to do that is assembly in other countries. But loopholes, while they should be explored, it's difficult to, grow a company in a sustainable way on a loophole. It's
yeah.
something that should be viewed as more of a short-term solution.
Agreed.
All right, so I think that's all we have time for today, Michael. We're at 55 minutes, so we should probably end it today. I was thinking, I wanted to run this idea by you that the next segment of this podcast, perhaps we could discuss reciprocal tariffs and their implications. What do you think about that?
I think it's a very good idea. You have a knack for picking difficult subjects. Reciprocal tariffs is certainly one of the more complex elements of a tariff policy, and one that seems very simple and straightforward, but is actually very complicated and would be fun to deal with that.
Great. So I will, send you a message about that. We can discuss and plan for that next time. But for today, I wanted to thank you so much for coming and spending time with us and our listeners on the supply chain of thought. And I hope that everyone listening, was able to learn something from the conversation. The main points, I think, are really that we need to stay agile and resilient despite the challenging times, or because of the challenging times. We need to stay agile and resilient.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Knowledge is power,
absolutely.
and we need to acquire as much knowledge as possible in order to be agile. Um,
Absolutely.
and I think that's what a lot of smart companies are doing.
Agree. So thank you, Michael. Until next time, I'll see you later.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate your input. It was very interesting.
Agreed. Likewise.
Bye.
Okay.